Okay, so again, I'm Yael Warshel, the founding director of the Children, Media, and Conflict Zones Lab. And we have with us today Luisina Kemanian-Leites, who is going to be presenting on her undergraduate honors thesis. As promised, I'm going to say a little bit more about Luisina than she said about herself a few minutes ago. So Luisina is a Paterno Fellow, graduating Paterno Fellow this semester. She is engaged in a host of public service activities while at Penn State, both at Penn State and beyond, that span minority, Latin, and voter registration initiatives and groups, ESL tutoring in the US as well as in Jordan, social justice and local city governance matters in the Washington, D.C., Baltimore area. She, as you know, is a former lab member. She said she worked here for 2 years when the lab started. She continued on for a number of years as a research assistant in a number of capacities as a Rock Ethics Institute Fellow, also supported by the Liberal Arts Undergraduate Enrichment Program. And she eventually was head RA her last periods here, helping me to administer the lab. And while at lab, she worked on several projects, some of which you are familiar with, other ones that we've completed. Most prominently, she worked on helping me with what was then a prospectus, and as she knows, is since a contracted book with Stanford University Press that some of you have become involved with. That book is entitled When Conflict is Real: Reimagining the Study of Children, Youth, and Media in International and Global Conflict Zones, which the topic of it basically formed the raison d'etre of the lab, right? What is the purpose of it? Searching for gaps in the literature between the relationship between children and media in conflict zones, insofar as how they use media, are affected by it, and or media cover them. So the book is really focused on searching for holes in the literature to ensure that the needed evidence for practitioners and policy makers exist for those who work with children in media and conflict zones. So again, Luisina helped a great deal with that, as I said, the prospectus, and then getting it to the point where it is as a contracted book. As she said to you about her majors and minors, I'll just restate them. So she's a double major in international politics with honors in Latin American studies. And then she has more minors than I thought, if there was a limit that would be allowed. Middle East studies, Arabic, and Spanish. After working in the lab, she went off and studied abroad, first in Chile and then in Jordan. She also engaged in a number of public service activities there that range from conference organizing about humanitarian aid to Lebanon, to teaching Peruvian, Venezuelan, and Haitian third graders inside Chilean classrooms. And then she came back to wrap up her thesis. And before she presents on that, and as she presented a few weeks ago at the undergraduate exhibition, she's going to be heading off next year in a Fulbright to Columbia. Maybe she has some other awards. I don't know if there's other awards coming. I wouldn't be surprised, but there might be. I don't know. But so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Luisina, and she's going to be presenting on the topic of a solution to the problem from hell: quantifying the effects of international military interventions during mass killings and genocides. So I turn it to you.
Thank you. That was the most professional overview that's ever been done of my career. All right, so I will go ahead and share my screen. Perfect. So yeah, I will be presenting. My thesis is on solutions to the problem from hell, quantifying the effects of international military interventions during mass killings and genocides. Background into how I got interested in this. My father's family is Armenian, so they actually survived the Armenian genocide of 1915. And from there, I've always just been interested in what can be done by the international community during mass killings and genocides, given their prevalence in the 20th and 21st centuries. So my research question was, why are some international military interventions during mass killings or genocides successful at decreasing their severity while others are not? And then from there, I developed 5 hypotheses to test. The first was to see if genocides with international military interventions actually experience less severe genocides. I assumed yes in my hypothesis, given that this is the most common tool used by international actors to affect change during mass killings and genocides. The second was that earlier interventions will be more likely to decrease the severity of killings. This stems from a lot of background research that's been done on the case of the Rwandan genocide. The third is that a higher number of deployed troops will be more likely to decrease the severity of killings. And we'll talk more about all the theory behind these later. And then the fourth and fifth relate to the directionality of the intervention. So if it's anti-perpetrator, that is anti-whatever actor is perpetrating the genocide, it will decrease the severity of killings, but if it's pro-perpetrator, it will actually increase the severity of killings. So this is a quantitative analysis. I didn't do any case studies. The time period I looked at was from 1955, so that's post the resolution of the recognizing genocides in the UN Convention, which is kind of when it became internationally acceptable to intervene militarily in the case of genocides, and then up until 2018. So the genocide and mass killing episodes data comes from the Political Instability Task Force data set, which looks from 1955 to 2018. And then the military intervention data came from the International Military Intervention data set, which looks from 1945 to 2005, and then which I extended personally to 2018 for the purposes of my study. And so then there's also 2 units of analysis because I conduct 2 different analyses. The first is country year. So the genocide data is organized by country year. There's like a ton of country, or it's a country over a span of time and how many people were killed each year that that genocide occurred. And then the military intervention is coded similarly. And then the other is the genocide episode, which just looks at each genocide on a whole individually. And of those, there were 45 cases. And then of the country years with genocides, there were 289. So a bit of background on directionality. The theory behind pro-perpetrator interventions, these tend to occur primarily the neighboring countries of a country will intervene militarily in support of the government perpetrating the crime. So I think a lot of cases that are the most easy case to think of is the DRC, just historically. And then, so because they help perpetrators defeat rebels so quickly, it can help rein in the killings, is what a past study found, that it actually decreases the severity of killing. Others argue that it actually emboldens the actor and allows them more resources to turn to killing the targeted group. Then there's anti-perpetrator interventions, which directly challenge the perpetrator. And the theory behind it is because you're directly challenging the perpetrator, it turns the attention away from their killings and they have to focus on you and your invasion of the country. The most successful case of this is when Bangladesh split from Pakistan and India actually intervened militarily in that war, and it severely dropped the number of killings in Bangladesh, what is now Bangladesh, but what was then East Pakistan. And then there's neutral interventions, so the UN interventions, which don't directly threaten the perpetrator. So these are kind of up in the air, the effect they have on genocide, because they're not challenging the person, but there's also, or the perpetrator, but there's also troops on the ground to kind of dissuade and show international interest in the issue and attention on the issue. So the next theory has to do with troop numbers, and this is where my work kind of moved away from the work of others, just because it's mainly been focused on directionality, and I also wanted to look at other factors of the military intervention. So with troop numbers, the idea behind it is that the more troops you deploy, it directs more attention away from the killing, and it also signals resolve to the perpetrator. So when you send too few troops in, it kind of shows that the country doesn't necessarily want to expend that much energy or resources on the issue. And so the country feeling that's being invaded feels that they have a chance to successfully challenge this intervening force. And just a note, states typically do send very few troops on any issue seen to be as humanitarian interventions, which is typical for genocides and mass killings. And then with timing, the thought is that early interventions are more effective because they stop mass killings before they reach their full height of violence. And also, the most infamous case of this is the Rwandan genocide of 1994, when UN military officials were saying that a genocide was upcoming and no one responded, and in the end, over 800,000 people were killed. However, when you look at this statistically, as genocides come to an end, there's just less people to kill due to people fleeing and already those killed before. So there's this confounding effect that late interventions may see less severe genocides, even though that's not necessarily causally related. So that was something I was looking out for as I approached my analysis. So here I just wanted to show, it's kind of small because unfortunately there were so many, but the episodes of genocides from 1955 to 2018. And those, it's pretty evenly split on whether they had an intervention or not. In a lot of countries actually had multiple genocides within this time period. So you can see that the range in the duration of J's is very long, and also the range in the severity of killings is also very varied. And then another way to look at it is like a map, just to spatially think about it. So this is an issue that's affected every continent in the world. You have Kosovo in the European Union, the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and then Central and South America as well. And then they're color coded. So the blue interventions have seen no intervention, or the blue countries have seen no interventions. The pink countries had interventions during the genocide, and the green ones had multiple genocides, some of which had interventions and some of which did not. So from this, you can see Southeast Asia and South America remains relatively untouched by interventions during, at least military interventions during genocides, while it's really common to intervene in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. Okay, so my first findings related to genocides with interventions versus those without. And what was most important from here is actually that it seems that interventions cause more harm than good in most cases during genocides. So the first is looking at the duration in days. This graph here, which I know is a little bit hard to see, lays out the number of days a genocide lasted. And here you have the severity of killings, but all the ones in blue, so what you see over here, are those genocides that didn't experience an intervention, and all except for one were between 0 to 2,000 days in duration, while those with an intervention, you have about half going well over 2,000 days into 4,000, 6,000 days. So what that indicates is that even if an intervention sees the relatively same numbers and severity of killings, just due to how much longer it goes on, a lot more lives are lost. And then in terms of the median severity of killings, genocide episodes with interventions tend to have slightly more. It's so the severity scale is 0 to 11, with 11 being more severe and 0 being less severe. So those with interventions have more severe genocides with about a 7, while those without an intervention see a 5 in severity of killings. So that indicates a potential increase in actually the severity of killings. And then looking more specifically into the different factors of the international military intervention, I found that in terms of directionality, anti-perpetrator interventions may increase the severity of killings, but it was not statistically significant. But more importantly, that pro-perpetrator interventions, as I had hypothesized, increase the severity of killings. And so one way to quantify it is through the odds ratio, which revealed that for genocides that experience a pro-perpetrator intervention, the odds of a more deadly rather than less deadly genocide are 2.59 times higher than for genocides that did not experience a pro-perpetrator intervention. And then troop amount actually was not statistically significant in the effect of interventions during genocides. Lastly, timing. Early interventions are critical for decreasing the severity of killings, despite the confounding factor that late interventions tend to see less severe killings just because they come so late. For genocides that experience early interventions, the odds of having a more deadly genocide as opposed to a less deadly genocide is 72% lower than for genocides that experience late interventions. So if you experience a late intervention, the odds of having a more deadly genocide are 3.57 times that of genocides that are early interventions. And the reason this is all in odds ratios is due to my dependent variable was ordinal, so that just means I had to do an ordered logit analysis, which leads to this very interesting way of thinking about the variables. So then I just have a quick list of conclusions here. Interventions may lengthen the duration of genocide, and they also experience slightly more deadly genocides. From that, I think there needs to be a change in foreign policy. This approach of always using military interventions does not seem to be the right approach at the moment. Early interventions are absolutely critical if there is going to be a military intervention, and new measures for the different variables I looked at, I think would be needed in future research, and maybe a pivot to studying prevention of over military interventions during genocides. So the diplomatic work that's done prior to a genocide occurring, just because when they start, it's incredibly difficult for them to stop. And then I just highlighted recent areas of concern to show how critical the research is. The Tigray region of Ethiopia has accusations of genocidal tactics used by both sides, and the foreign diplomat who was deployed there said that there are estimates of around 700,000 dead. There's Artsakh, which has been blockaded by the Azerbaijani government for the past couple of months and is not letting any food or aid into the Armenian people. You have the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar who continue to face persecution, both in Myanmar and then those who were forced to leave after the genocide in 2016 and currently are in Bangladesh, and then also reports coming out of Russian tactics in Ukraine. And that's it. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you, Luisina. Any questions?
Like just like one general question, like what does it look like those pro-perpetrator and like anti-perpetrator like intervention tactics? Because I don't really know what those are.
So a pro-perpetrator intervention would look like my military goes into Dr. Warshell's country, and Dr. Warshell, is committing a genocide, and my troops aid her in some type of way, maybe in fighting the rebels or in providing troops to her forces. While an anti-perpetrator intervention would be me intervening and directly fighting with Dr. Warshell's forces or directly aiding the targeted group.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Good question. Others? I have a couple of questions that I want to be sure I understood here. So the findings are intervene early, right? That's or the recommendation.
Mm-hmm.
And then this is sort of building on what Renata asked that I'm also trying to understand. So interventions, you shouldn't support the perpetrator, which seems kind of logical, right?
Yes.
Then it was not statistically significant. I don't know if you can go back to that slide, that if it was anti-perpetrator.
Yeah, so anti-perpetrator interventions actually, the coefficient shows it was positive, so it was associated with an increase in the severity of killings, but it wasn't a significant enough increase to statistically say like it could be causally related. But it does draw us back to the idea that military interventions do tend to see higher severity of killings after.
Okay. So this one is counterintuitive, but not statistically significant.
Right.
What, and I don't know, I'm sorry if you said this, what is the percentage breakdown between numbers of interventions that support the perpetrator versus anti-perpetrator?
They were almost equal. So there were about 60 country years that experienced an genocide and an intervention at the same time. And of those, it was about 20 had an anti-perpetrator intervention, 20 had a pro-perpetrator intervention, and 20 had neutral interventions, roughly. It was incredibly even.
Okay. And remind me, is partially what is neutral, but if it is the same thing as my question's about to be, but what happens in the example, like you're putting a spotlight right now on Ethiopia vis-a-vis Tigray and Eritrea, when you're saying both sides are committing genocidal acts, what would it mean? And if support is being lent to both sides, kind of going back to Renata's question, like, would that be a pro and an anti? How would you label that?
So that's actually a great question. And there were a lot of cases where multiple countries intervene at the same time, and then they react like on different sides. And what I had to do was I just took whoever had the biggest intervention in terms of troops deployed, with the assumption that that was the one that had the largest impact, just because it was the biggest number of troops. So I think the best case is Kosovo again. Serbia deployed troops in support of Serbians in Kosovo, while NATO supported like the Kosovo independence movement. And so since NATO deployed more military force than did Serbia, in my analysis, I preferred looking at the data with the lens of the NATO intervention as opposed to the Serbian.
And so how did you end up labeling that? I mean, I think this also partially requires making an opinion.
Yeah. So past research had tried to like use numbers and then subtract. So if this many people intervened and they were positive and this many people were anti, like whatever the middle ground is, we'll use. And I didn't think that was really what I wanted, where I wanted my research to go. I wanted to take a bit more of a rational approach, which unfortunately meant leaving out some, because the assumption is whoever sent the bigger number of troops is just going to be the one that had the biggest impact.
So did you label the NATO forces as pro perpetrator or anti?
They,
that
in that case, they were anti.
Okay, and because so you're that, I mean, because it's like there can be politics that enter into that definition, right? It's
And
obviously highly politicized.
if they sent like this, if it was roughly the same number of troops deployed by both sides, it was randomly chosen by Excel.
Okay. But in that
Which country would be in the data set.
Okay. But so in that case, though, the example you gave, that would be an anti-perpetrator, which was the not statistically significant, but it still showed greater numbers of casualty or deaths. And you weren't looking at casual, I mean, you haven't said the word, but I just want to clarify, you weren't looking at casualties writ large, like also injuries, just deaths.
It's just deaths of non-combatants. So it doesn't look at any rebels. It solely looks at civilian targets.
Okay. So, so in those cases, if it's 2, you labeled it as based on the higher troop count, and then and then it depended if it ended up being pro or anti. Okay, so compare that then to neutral, if you don't mind saying the definition again of how it would be different from that.
And so neutral would be some like a force that goes in and supports neither side. And just this is primarily UN peacekeeping troops.
Okay, got it. Okay, that makes more sense to me. Is okay.
Yeah, that's almost neutral is almost exclusively UN peacekeeping troops, or maybe even African Union peacekeeping troops.
Okay, and you said the result there. I'm sorry, you said it before, but I
so it's neutral. Neutral interventions were compared to anti-perpetrator and pro-perpetrator interventions. So it's just comparative. It's thinking of like the pro-perpetrator versus neutral intervention. So a pro-perpetrator is much more deadly than a neutral intervention is. But specifics on neutral interventions, I don't have. It's all comparison because of the statistical analysis used.
Okay. And was anti-perpetrator more deadly than neutral?
Yes.
Okay. But you don't have whether peacekeeping is more deadly than no peacekeepers. That you didn't look at.
Well, they're included in interventions. So the data that looks at interventions versus no intervention.
Okay, as an aggregate.
Right.
Okay, and you said that was 20%. Okay. Do other people have questions? If I kind of tried to unpack it, at least for me, I needed some follow-up there and definitions. Others have questions?
What was your research method? Was it like a content analysis or what exactly? And what the sources? Is it like news stories or research article?
So it was fully quantitative. It used an ordinal logic regression to run my analysis. And all the data came from existing data sets already. I can go back to those if anyone wants them. And then for international military intervention data set, I extended it from 2005 to 2018. And to do that, it's looking at a multitude of news resources that they had already used in the past and verified or the makers of the data set had already verified and used in the past. So mainly that, because a lot of data during genocides and mass killings is really not easily accessible due to the nature of the crime, and that since governments tend to be the perpetrators, they downplay a lot of the numbers of civilians killed. And so that's why we use a range of severity of killing instead of the exact number killed, because it's just impossible to know accurately the exact number killed. Great question.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was going to be kind of part of my question too. How do you know like what the exact numbers are for the specific genocides, and does that really impact your outcomes? Because I'm sure it also varies based on where these genocides are happening as to the reporting, also based on, you know, the pro or anti. So like, what is the certainty of that data, if any?
Right. So because of the uncertainty of the data, you have to use a range of numbers killed. It's just UCDP releases their best estimates down to like they will give you 200,001 people were killed. But at the end of the day, those are just estimates. So it's better to place them in a range, and it might undercount or overstate certain genocides, but typically there were more people killed, I think, than is generally reported.
And is that recorded like per population of the group being killed, or like how is the severity determined? Okay.
So it's not, but given that there are populations that are smaller, that's something that was taken into account by the PITF data set. So when they looked at different cases, if the population was really small, and so a very small number of people were correspondingly killed, they still included it in the data set just because for that population, it was actually a large group of people.
Are both the data sets UCDP or no?
Neither.
Okay, whose are they?
PITF it's the Political Instability Task Force. It's commissioned by the U.S. Department of Defense, I want to say.
Okay.
And then International Military Intervention data set is that it was started by two political scientists at University of Michigan, and then later extended 2005. And then there hasn't been another extension yet.
Okay. Whose is it at Michigan? Whose data sets is it? Or
I want to say it's Pickering and someone else, but I can get you the exact
okay.
names.
Yeah, no, and that's, I mean, Raina, to your question, so there's mass discrepancies for every genocide, and two ways to look at it is that anyone, you know, it's a great question. At the same time, anyone who studies genocide has to deal with this, you know, and that's what is done in the field because of that. And the other thing to keep in mind is, you know, if you were to do a follow-up analysis, is that victims will always, I don't know if I'll say always, but I don't believe I've seen things to suggest otherwise. You'll have larger numbers reported by victims and lower numbers reported by perpetrators, right? This is, you know, strategically. And so that's something to keep in mind, right? If you're looking at the range, you know, from, you know, what is it, where is it in the range, thinking about reporting and from whose vantage point, that's something that you could do kind of follow-up analysis, keeping that in mind. But otherwise, as Luisina is doing, you start from the range, and that's quite typical because it's so politically fraught. It's the norm.
Mm-hmm. And they're not always, I guess, so mainly genocides tend to be perpetrated by governments, but I did want to mention that they can also be committed by non-state actors, and that is included in the data set, primarily Daesh or ISIS in Iraq with Yazidi women.
And another thing to keep in mind, I mean, I think going back to Luisina's initial kind of personal interest in this, when I say the range is the norm, because of the discrepancies, you can also think about the fact that there are genocides to this day that are not recognized, right? And so that if you're not recognizing a genocide, that basically means that you put the number at 0, right? If you want to quantify it. So, you know, I mean, the discrepancies are large, and they're unfortunately the norm. So. Other questions? I don't know if Alexi, you had any questions?
Yeah, I was actually going to ask the same questions that Reina and Sakina mentioned, but I think Luciana already covered them really eloquently.
So one other question I had, or just kind of clarifying. So as far as recommendations, start earlier, definitely do not support the perpetrator. It's not really, even though it's not statistically significant, probably supporting the anti-perpetrator is neither a good intervention. Peacekeeping.
In general, the takeaway is kind of military interventions might not be the best solution we have, is the better way to think of it. Even if you go in with the best purposes, just by the nature of how much they're extended in duration, and this is supported by a lot of research into conflict studies, actually, that when an intervention occurs during a war, like a civil war, then it actually increases the duration significantly, just by virtue of increasing the time period. You see more people killed. But that's not to say, obviously, that nothing should be done. It's just encouraging looking into different avenues for dealing with genocides and mass killings.
And so, but you're taking peacekeeping out of military intervention. Are you saying that is worthwhile?
No, that is in military interventions.
So you're also saying it's better not to have peacekeeping forces?
That seems to be indicated by the data in mine.
Okay. And the one thing I thought was surprising was the troop count, the sort of, right, what you mentioned earlier, that it sounded like low commitment, it's either ignored or embolds the actor, but you're saying you didn't see any difference in the troop count.
Yeah, that surprised me as well. So I didn't find any support for that hypothesis, that higher troop numbers see less severe intervention or less severe genocides.
And was that analyzed in relation to the peacekeeping or no?
How do you mean? That takes all interventions and their troop numbers deployed and ran a comparison.
And it included if it's peacekeepers.
Right, it included all interventions.
Okay.
All the data looked at all interventions. Yeah,
okay.
That were military.
Interesting. How would you try to explain that?
Honestly, I was very surprised. I think I'd explain it primarily by how illogical, irrational genocides are. And so when you're a perpetrator, I'm just not sure what there is that's going to stop you, because a lot of it is tied to very deep ethnic conflicts. And I think that can drive actions beyond what can be logically reasoned. And so what we think theoretically should work, because logically, if I send a ton of troops, that should stop you from wanting to kill people. It just might not be the case given the action.
Are there any other questions, comments? I know you didn't look at this, but was there anything comparing if, on the one hand, troops were younger, like child soldiers, or if those were killed non-combatants, if there's a difference between, let's just say, use a biological age definition, like under 18, those were killed. I don't think you looked at any of that, but in case.
No, I didn't.
Okay.
And I also don't think a lot of data would be available on that to begin with, just because countries tend to want, as you know, countries tend to want to hide when they use child soldiers in their armies.
And on the other side, as far as the casualty counts?
Casualty count wasn't divided by any type of age or sex or anything.
Okay. Thought I'd ask.
Oh, good question.
Well, thank you very much. That's great, wonderful presentation. Obviously not a happy subject, but very important as we think about the applications of this kind of research. So thank you for choosing that topic and spending time doing research on it and sharing it with us.
Yeah, thank you all for having me and the great questions and listening.